Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time. Hold on 1 second. Okay. Okay, welcome everyone. We are in Masechet Sukkot, and this is our second lesson in this series of Masechet Sukkah. Today we are going to review Daf Zayin, which is 7, through Yud Gimel, which is 13. So we're going to be doing 7 through 13. And as I mentioned last time, we have a lot of pictures in this Masechet. So those of you who enjoy pictures like I do, I hope you enjoy these pictures. Okay, and we are going to get started. Okay, 1 second. I'm just going to open up my chat. So if anybody has any questions while we're learning, feel free to write them in the chat box. Okay, here we go. So Daf 7, so we're actually going to start from Daf 6 at the end. We're talking about, we ended last week, we were talking that the Sukkah needs to have 2 full walls plus a little bit of a third wall. So the question on today's daf, on daf 7 that we're going to discuss right now, is where does that third wall go? So at the bottom of 6, the Gemara says that maybe it goes, again, at a right angle from, they're calling this wall the main wall, basically the back wall, where one wall, full wall, touches it, and on the other side, opposite that full wall, will be our tefach wall. Again, tefach is the hand breadth. So that tefach wall is going to be opposite it. Daf 7 starts at the top of 7, says, well, wait a minute, maybe it should be on a diagonal. You can see here at the floor, they draw a diagonal. Instead of it being a right angle to the wall, maybe it should be diagonal from it. The truth is, if you think about it, then we would have a very small sukkah, but maybe that's what it means. And the Gemara says, no, it actually means that it could be across from the other main wall, and it could even be separate, meaning not attached to the main wall, as long as it's within 3 tfachim. So just to remind ourselves, we learned last week, one of the many concepts that we are going to see over and over again in Masechet Sukkah is the concept, in Hebrew it's called lavud. Lavud means this airspace is seen as almost nullified. It doesn't really count. So if something is within 3 hand breadths, so you can kind of measure that, whatever that is, like from here to here. So if it's within 3 hand breadths, it's as if it's attached to the wall. So you can see here in the picture that the tefach wall, again, it's not really a wall, it's actually a post, can even be it doesn't have to touch the wall, it could be within 3 tfachim of the main wall. The Gemara now entertains another option. Again, we have 2 plus 1. So till now we've said that the 2 big walls need to be right angles from each other. The Gemara entertains that maybe the 2 walls can actually be parallel to each other, and then the tefach wall almost connects them, even though it doesn't really, because it's not touching both of the walls. So the Gemara seems to say that this might be okay. And then the Gemara says, no, that's already, that's not enough, meaning having this 1 tefach is not enough. However, if you have this, you can see here, kind of like a plank that is within 3 of one of the walls, so that's as if it's touching, and it itself is 4 tfachim, then that would be considered okay, because now we have a much wider plank, or I guess longer plank, and then that would be considered a wall, and then that would be okay. And then the Gemara says, again, if the walls are if the main walls are in right angles of each other, then the third wall only needs to be a tefach, 1 hand breadth. But if they're parallel to each other, then the other wall needs to be at least 4 tfachim. So that's how we are going to leave it. Another suggestion is that it doesn't need only, or it needs more than that one tefach. Rather, it needs, and those of you who learned Masechet Eruvin and Shabbat, we had this concept called Tsurat HaPetach. Tsurat HaPetach looks like a doorway, right? You can see here there are 2 posts with like a lintel, right? Like a cross beam on top. And Rava says that's what you need for the 3rd wall, because then it really looks like, I guess, the skeleton of a wall. So he says that you need that this like Surat HaPetach. And now there's basically 3 different ways to understand it. Remember, we said that the 3rd wall can have a tefach. So does it mean that each one of these white poles can be half a tefach, meaning half and half make a whole, and then they combine together, and that would make a whole? Or the other option is they don't need a tefach at all, meaning they can even be less than a tefach. Here you can see it very thin, because a tzurat hapetach is a very structured structure, and therefore it doesn't have to be a minimal width. Or maybe it needs to be, again, one of the sides needs to be 1 tefach wide, the other side it doesn't matter at all. And here you see that again. And here in this picture again, you have lavud, that it doesn't need to touch the main wall. It could be within 3 tfachim of the wall. And from here, the Gemara on Daf 7, Daf Zayin, goes into a parallel, and we're going to see this throughout this Masechet, where we're going to parallel concepts that we saw in Masechet Shabbat and Eruvin to Sukkah. Again, why is that happening? Because in Eruvin and in Shabbat, we needed to create a domain. We needed to create partitions. And if partitions exist in a certain way in those tractates, the Gemara here is saying, well, let's take that parallel to Masechet Shabbat. So here you see the Gemara says on 7, right? Amar Rava v'chein l'Shabbat, right? And so too for Shabbat. Now, if you look at this picture, what's interesting is the wall of the house is considered a wall. And then you have one more wall, so that's 2 full walls. And you see that if you just put this little tefach post on the opposite side, then that creates a domain, right? And the Gemara discusses that this would be valid to be able to carry within that area, even though I don't have 4 full walls. What we're saying here is just like it works for Sukkah, it also works for Shabbat. So let's say if you built, right, let's say if you see this picture, let's say the front is actually the Reshut HaRabim, the main public thoroughfare, and you built your Sukkah right here outside of your house. The Gemara says that because it works for Sukkah, and this will be a valid Sukkah, this now becomes your private domain, and you can carry from your house into your Sukkah. So that's just an interesting correlation between Sukkot, Sukkah and Shabbat. Here, the Gemara talks about, again, needing these slats, again, which might create more of a wall. And here, if you remember in Masechet Eruvin, we talked about, let me just see if it's right here or not yet. 1 second. Hold on a minute. Okay. Remember when we talked about in Eruvin building a wall or a partition, there was a concept that we needed it to be more solid than open space. This was, right, omed yoter mehaparutz, meaning you can have spaces, and in Eruvin we discussed how wide those spaces could be, but we said that there needed to be more solid than space. So that is in terms of Shabbat. In Shabbat, we need it to be more solid than airspace, but not necessarily for Shabbat. Not necessarily for Sukkot. Again, let me say that again. For Shabbat, you need there to be more solid wall than empty space. For Sukkah, you do not need that. For Sukkah, there could still be more empty space than solid walls, as long as you have two full walls plus a little bit. Now, here, interestingly, if you look at this picture, 44, these would still be considered two solid walls because the space in between is considered close enough together that it's seen as a full wall, plus the tefach at the other end, which makes three walls. So it's just interesting to see how this works in terms of Sukkah and Shabbat. From here, the Gemara goes on to discuss a topic that we did again in Eruvin. Remember when we talked about the well? There were these wells that were put out in the major thoroughfares, in the Reshut Harabim, in the public domain. These wells were for the Jewish people who were going to Jerusalem on their way they were going to Jerusalem for the festival. And remember, we said that let's say they got to a well on Shabbat and they needed to give water to their animals, but the well was in the public domain. So what would they do? It was very hard to build an entire enclosure, and therefore they built these corners, right? They were called pasei biraot. If you can look carefully, on four corners of the well, there are these right angles. Each one of these, each side is at least a tefach, and they make right angles, right? So there are four right angles, right, one in every corner. So the Gemara here says that since that works as a partition for Shabbat, then maybe I can make a schach on top of those corners, and maybe that would be considered a kosher sukkah. Now, again, interestingly enough, we would think that there isn't even one full wall, but the Gemara teaches us that since this works as a partition for Shabbat, then the Gemara says it also works as a kosher sukkah. So this actually is a valid sukkah. Okay, the Gemara on 7 continues. Remember, we talked about shade versus sun. That's how we decide if the schach, the covering, is a valid covering or not. And the Gemara says that if there's too much sun, because there's not enough schach, again, schach is the roof, if that's the reason, then it would be invalid. But maybe, says the Gemara, even because the walls let in too much sun, right? If the walls let in too much sun, then maybe that would be an invalid sukkah, right? Maybe here, this is actually, you can see here, it's like on a balcony, and there isn't a lot of shade here. The Gemara says, no, that's not the case. When we're talking about sun versus shade, it's only about the roof, the schach, and not about the walls. So that is not an issue. The Gemara continues and says, remember we talked about the sukkah needing to be somewhat permanent. Again, we know that the structure needs to be temporary. That is really the essence of the sukkah. We're going to talk about the essence in a little bit. But the Gemara says at the bottom of 7 that it needs to be somewhat permanent in the sense that it needs to be at least 4 by 4 amot, or the walls, again, as we said, maybe they can't let in too much light, or maybe there's some who say you actually need 4 full walls, even though we said it doesn't, or that you can't make a sukkah on top of a ship because, again, it's not permanent. Later on in the Masecha, we'll talk about sukkot on top of different interesting things. The Gemara continues and says, what's another way to define permanence? Maybe the table needs to be in the Sukkah. Remember, we talked about the difference of opinion, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, if the table needs to be in the Sukkah or not. Another option here is these strange shapes, that the Sukkah cannot be these shapes, right? It can't be like a teepee, right? That triangle, and it can't be like a leaning against a wall, right? Because then there aren't really, again, we said there need to be two full walls, and we don't have that. Again, two full walls plus a little bit and a roof. We don't have that in these structures. And from here, we are going to get into a lengthy discussion. I am not going to get into a lengthy discussion, but the Gemara went into a lengthy discussion about a round sukkah. Meaning, again, we talked about it having to need 2 walls, 3 walls, 4 walls. The Gemara says, don't get confused. You can have a round sukkah, but then the Gemara at the bottom of 7 and on to 8 discusses what is the minimum area of a round sukkah. Remember, we said if the minimum area of if the minimum area needs to be 4 by 4 amot, then how do we translate from a square into a circle, right? Not everybody was very good at geometry, and we can even see this as we continue on Daf 8. Yes, Lynn mentions how they measured that. They said every person is at least an amah. So that's interesting to think that every person is this wide. Maybe, I don't know. But here they said it needs to be wide enough that 24 people, you can see here, everybody's dressed in their Shabbos clothes, 24 people can sit around in a circle. The Gemara, again, I don't want to go into all the geometry. If anybody likes geometry, this is your daf, because it talks about, again, we talked about it being 4 by 4 as a square. So how do we inscribe? You can see here, how do you inscribe a 4 by 4 square, and how do you inscribe a circle in it? What would be the radius or diameter of that circle? And then the Gemara says, oh, no. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe here you see it's like a square and then a circle inside. Maybe the circle's on the outside and the square is on the inside, which would make it a larger circle. Maybe here the Gemara, you could see the people. Maybe the circle is the amount of people that can sit on the outside, right? If the people are sitting on the outside, now the circle is much smaller. But the bottom line is, and here's like the conclusion is basically that it's still 24 people sitting around, which will give you a 16, again, area of 16 in the middle. And again, that was a lot of geometry that you can go and look up if you like geometry. Okay, I'm going to continue on Daf 8. And here we're going to talk about different huts. I like Lynn mentioned airline seats. That's great. The Gemara on Daf 8 it continues talking about different huts. Now, again, we are going to get into another very important concept. I think we had it last week. Okay, if not, we're going to have it now, which we're going to get to in a minute. But we're going to say again, remember, in those days, people built all types of different temporary structures. And the question is, can you use those ready-made structures as a sukkah? Again, a sukkah is just a hut. Now, most of us do not own huts in our field, backyard, front yard, porch. It's not something that we generally have, even though nowadays we do have, let's say, a pergola here in Israel. Many people have a pergola in their backyard or a gazebo. But in those days, they did have huts. So the question was, could you use a hut that already existed? So first, the Gemara talks about a potter's hut, and it seems that they would build these like double huts. It would be one on the outside and one on the inside. And basically, they would work on the outer hut and they would live on the inner hut. So the Gemara says that the outer one doesn't need a mezuzah because nobody is living in it, but it can be, and it can be a sukkah, again, because it's a temporary residence. It's not the potter's regular residence. Whereas the inner hut, where he sleeps, does need a mezuzah and can't be a sukkah. So you see that those are inversely proportional or inversely conceptual. If it needs a mezuzah, that means it's permanent and it can't be a sukkah, and the inverse is correct. Now, interesting, I thought this was a very interesting discussion of other types of huts. So the Gemara says that the following 4 huts are considered valid for use. What are these huts? It was a hut made by a non-Jew, a hut made by women, meaning the women's hut. This, I guess, was something that was either common or a woman decided that she wanted to make a hut that was made for animals, or a hut that was made by the Kutim. Again, the Kutim are a nation of people that lived in Israel that converted, and throughout the Talmud we're going to see if they are likened to non-Jews or not. But here the Gemara says that these 4 types of huts are valid, even though all the people that built them are not obligated to sit in a sukkah. So we see that if someone is not obligated to sit in a sukkah and they build a sukkah, that sukkah is deemed valid. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is the following group of huts that are also valid. These are huts that were built by the shepherds, again in the field there, or in the pasture when they go with their animals. The huts that were built by the people who are drying fruit in the field, or the ones who are guarding the field, all of these huts are built temporarily, right? They're just there for the season, for the week, or even for the day, like the shepherd. And again, the Gemara says that these are valid, even though they're not permanent structures. As long as for all of these cases, as long as the schach, again, we mentioned that the schach is the most, I'll say the most important part, or at least the most complicated part that we've been talking about. The schach, the roof, needs to have been put there for shade, and that is the use that it was put there for, and therefore it would be valid. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Daf number 9. At the top, we have a new Mishnah. Okay. There's a machloket if you can use an old schach or sukkah, meaning if you have this hut in your backyard and you left branches there from the middle of the year, you decided to put branches on top. The question is that valid for Sukkot? Can you use it as a sukkah? Beit Shammai says, no, you need to have put the schach on top with the intention of creating a sukkah, right? In Hebrew, l'shem mitzvah or lishma, right? You had to have built it, or at least put the schach on top to make it a sukkah. Beit Hillel says, no, it's fine as long as it is a valid structure, then you can use it as a sukkah. Again, what is an old structure? More than 30 days before Sukkot. So the Gemara says, again, that on Daf 9, that the sukkah is for God, and therefore the schach needs to have been put there for Sukkot, meaning for the festival. Beit Hillel says, no, it doesn't matter as long as it is there and it's valid, then it is okay. Okay. Therefore, okay. So now we get into a discussion about tzitzit, which is very interesting. We said, again, the sukkah needs to be made for the mitzvah of sukkah. So the Gemara is now going to take that and find a parallel discussion in something completely different, though related, and that is making tzitzit. Again, tzitzit are the fringes that are put on the four corners of a garment, and these fringes need to be put on the garment for the mitzvah, for the commandment of tzitzit. And therefore, the Gemara says that let's say you wove the garment and you've leftover threads, you can't just use those as the fringes, right? You can't just say, oh, I've leftover thread on the garment. Those are the fringes, right? Rather, they need to be tied on with the intent of fulfilling a mitzvah. And therefore, the Gemara says that it is maybe it's a similar parallel disagreement. Okay, the next Mishnah says that you can't build a sukkah in a tree. I think this is very famous. We know that, right, you can't have your sukkah under a tree. Here it's in a tree, but the idea is that there are branches above you. Again, the schach, which I think we mentioned, but I'll say it again, the roof is not allowed to be made with something that is connected to the ground. And therefore, if you put your sukkah in the tree, so now your schach is attached to the tree, and that doesn't work. The Gemara continues and says that a sukkah on top of another sukkah, meaning a double-decker sukkah. We're going to get to a lot of pictures in a minute, but a sukkah on top of a sukkah, maybe when we'll go through different permutations, but maybe the top one is valid and the lower one is invalid, right? Again, the top one has a proper schach, proper roof. The bottom one doesn't because, there are people living above it. And we'll see the different permutations there. So now the Gemara says, so now let's talk about this tree. So if there's more shade than sun, right, then it would be invalid because the shade is coming from the branches in the tree, and those are connected to the tree, and those are invalid. However, if there is more sun than shade, meaning let's say it's a very bare tree, then maybe it would be valid, says the Gemara. Another option, says the Gemara, is what if you took the branches, and here you can see in the picture, what if you took the branches and you wove it, or at least you wove the branches into your already valid schach, right? So it's a part of your schach. So the Gemara says that if they are in the minority and the majority of the roof is valid schach, meaning valid branches, then it would be okay, which is interesting because we're going to see later on in the Masachet that you can nullify things that are in the minority, right? It can be batel, right? Like we have the concept in when we have milk and meat, the concept of something being batel, nullified, right? If I pour by accident, of course, not on purpose, but if I pour by accident a little drop of milk into a very big pot of chicken soup, I'm not saying what the law is, but the idea is that if it's a very small amount, then it becomes nullified in that very big pot. So too here, it seems that if you wove this one branch into your valid schach, it would be valid. Okay. Then the Gemara continues. Okay, let's go to the double sukkah. So basically, as we've come to know and love, the Gemara is going to give us 4 different permutations, right? So we have 2 sukkot, meaning one is on top and one is on the bottom. And the Gemara basically says, I can construct a case where both of them are valid, both of them are invalid, the top one is valid, and the bottom one is valid. So let's go through each one of the cases, and I'm very thankful for these pictures. These pictures, actually, if I didn't mention it, come from a book called, I forgot what it's called. Oh, HaMa'or HaMevu'ar. and it means like it's enlightened and described. And I downloaded it from a website called the Portal Daf Hayomi. It's a Hebrew Daf Yomi site, and they very, very graciously uploaded the entire PDF of this book as a tool. So I am thankful to them and this great book. Okay, let's get back to the picture. So how can we construct a case where both the upper and the lower sukkah sukkot are valid? So the Gemara says that if, again, so let's just remember what we need. We need a structure that is within 20 amot. Remember, we said not higher, and where the schach gives us more shade than sun. Okay, so here we go. How do we construct a case where both are valid? This is like a good like brain teaser for anyone who wants to kind of check if they can construct these cases, but the Gemara is going to tell us. So now, if the bottom one, if the schach at the bottom has more sunlight, right? So meaning, if you look down here, there's very little schach on this roof, and therefore it's not a valid schach. But how does that help us? Because then the upper one is valid for both sukkot, right? Meaning, if the whole structure is 20, so then the whole structure becomes kosher because the bottom one is not a kosher schach, so it doesn't divide the space. And then it seems that you can sit both in the top and in the bottom. Okay, so that is case number one. Case number two is basically the exact opposite. These are both invalid, right? Where both have more sunlight, and the upper one is higher than 20 amot, right? So now none of them are valid because they are both, they don't have proper schach, and it's too tall, like the whole structure is too tall. The next is, both of them have more shade than sunlight. Sorry, more shade than sunlight, and it's above 20. Here again, we're going to construct a case where the bottom one has a valid schach, right? Again, you see the bamboo, so it has more shade in the bottom one. So that bottom structure is valid. The top one has too little schach, and therefore it's more sun than shade. So the top one is invalid. The bottom one is valid. So you can sit downstairs. You cannot sit upstairs. And the last case, where the upper one has a valid schach, and therefore you can sit here. But if you balance it with, if the bottom one also has valid schach, now you combine the two schachs, and that's already invalid because you now have a double schach, right? And we're going to learn, we haven't learned it yet, but down here, this airspace is really under two valid roofs, and you can't have that. And therefore, the top one is valid, and the bottom one is invalid. Okay, those are our double sukkot. Okay, now we're going to get, one second, let's go on to the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah is going to, sorry, we are on Daf 10 now, Daf 10, and the next Mishnah says that if you cover the schach with a sheet, here you don't have a picture of it, but basically if you put a sheet right under your schach to basically, let's say, protect from the sun or from the rain, that is not valid. And if you put a canopy on your bed, you want to be very fancy and you want to have a 4-poster bed in your sukkah, this is not valid. Again, you're creating a double roof. And you are, right, if you sleep in this bed, you're not sleeping under the schach, rather you're sleeping under this sheet, and that sheet is not valid schach. So that is not okay. However, says the Gemara, if you make the canopy on top of 2 posts, right? So this is like I don't know the name for it, but right, if it looks like this, then that would be okay because again, you didn't make a roof, you basically just made kind of sloped walls. So this would be okay. So now the Gemara says on Daf 10 at the bottom that if the sheet is decorative, um, maybe it would be okay. And then the Gemara says, again, you can hang decorations, right? We all hang decorations on your sukkah, and as long as it's decorative, it is okay. However, right in the old days, it seems that they used to hang fresh fruit from their sukkot. And if anybody has ever visited the Shomronim, the Samaritans, they are a sect. They used to be, I would say, they used to be a sect of Judaism, but they are no longer a sect of Judaism. They are their own religion. But they actually make a sukkah, and the whole roof is made up. You can Google it. It's actually beautiful. It's all made of fresh fruit because they hang the fruit as their schach. The Gemara says that if you do this, you may not eat from it over Sukkot because it becomes part of your sukkah, and therefore, but if you said, like, I'm hanging these grapes, but I want them for tomorrow lunch, then it's okay. So that's just an interesting thing about the decorations. Okay, the next, but the Gemara says that if you want, you can hang decorations on the wall, right? Not horizontally, rather vertically, and this is a custom definitely here in Israel. I would imagine all over that people hang either decorative posters, fabrics, carpets on their walls, and that is okay. And it doesn't, as long as it doesn't like narrow the sukkah. Okay, so as we said, right? So we said that you can sleep under this canopy if it is, again, over 2 posts and not over the 4 posts. Again, if you have only 2 posts, then it is valid. There's a discussion if the posts, maybe they have to be above 10 tfachim, under 10 tfachim. And the question is that considered its own area? Daf 11 talks about the bridal canopy. It seems this was a special type of bed that, again, was on 2 posts, and therefore it doesn't have a roof, and therefore it is valid to sleep under that in your sukkah. Again, if the poles are permanent, then even if it's less than 10 tfachim, if it is a flat roof, then it would be invalid. Okay, the next Mishnah on Daf 11 talks about vines in the schach, meaning you have grapevines, and the question is, again, if it's attached to the ground, we said it is invalid as schach. And it says that, again, anything that can become impure and didn't grow from the ground is not valid schach. Again, anything, and we're going to go through different things in a few minutes, what would be considered valid versus invalid schach. So the criteria is that meaning valid schach is something that cannot become impure, and we'll see what that is in a minute, and it needed to have grown from the ground, right? Which is why we put branches or bamboo or palm leaves as our schach, because they are things that have grown from the ground. And now we're going to learn a very important concept. In Hebrew, it's called ta'aseh velo min ha'asui. What does that mean? The Gemara says that the schach, that's the roof of the sukkah, must be placed there and cannot be just there, right? That was our problem with building the sukkah in a tree, right? I didn't place the branches on top of my sukkah, they just happened to be there. That is not a valid sukkah, right? There needs to be ta'aseh. Ta'aseh means do it, right? There needs to be an action that is done, and it can't just be there from before. Now, Let's say it was there from before. Let's give, for example, let's say you built a sukkah last year and you really liked the way it looked, so you decided to keep it there the whole year. This year, are you allowed, or I'll take that back because that was made as a sukkah. Let's say in the middle of the year you decide to create some structure in your backyard that looks like a sukkah and would be valid. And now comes to Sukkot. Can I use that structure? So the Gemara says you need to shake the schach, meaning lift it up and put it down or shake it around. And then that's enough of an action to have been placed there. You don't have to take it all off and put it all back on, but you shake it around a little bit, and then that would be enough. Rav says, actually, again, we were talking about vines. So maybe, right, what if I took the vines that were still attached to the ground, I put them over my sukkah. Now, we said it's not allowed to be attached to the ground. So can I just cut them? And now, would it be valid? Now, what's the problem? When I put them on my sukkah, they were invalid. Now I cut them. Now they're valid, but they're already there. So the question is cutting it enough of an action? Right? That's one opinion. The other opinion is no, you need to, cutting it is not enough. You need to also shake those vines in order for it to be valid. And now, since we're talking about ta'aseh velo min ha'asui, as I mentioned before, we're going to correlate it to tzitzit again, right? Again, just to remind us, the Gemara likes to it's not going on a tangent. It's actually bringing together different themes or different sugiot, different concepts that have the same variables or the same fundamental concepts in them. So again, we're talking about a sukkah, and all of a sudden we're jumping to tzitzit, because as I mentioned before, we have the same idea. Tzitzit need to be tied on the garment. So what if, and here are a few cases. First of all, this story is fascinating because it says that Rav Amram Chasida was tying tzitzit on his wife's garment. So just to remind us, women are not obligated to wear tzitzit. We know from Masechet Kiddushin that tzitzit, or at least the majority opinion is that tzitzit are a time-bound mitzvah. They only need to be done during the day and not the night, and therefore women are not obligated in tzitzit. Interestingly enough, Rav Amram Chasida's wife did wear tzitzit. It seems that he held that it was not a time-bound commandment, and therefore women were or are commanded to do it. So that's just interesting. That is a minority opinion, but most people say that that is not the case. So that's just an interesting aside. But what's the issue? Look here. The tzitzit are made of 8 strands, really 4 strands that are doubled over so that you have 4 and 4, and then you tie them. What's interesting, he asked, what if I take one string and I go back and forth? If you look very carefully at the bottom, the strings are actually all attached. So you don't have fringes. You have one fringe that goes back and forth. So the question is, if he threaded them all through and then tied them and then cut them, would that be okay? Now, again, as I mentioned, while they were threaded, they were invalid. And then is cutting it enough? So that is one option. The Gemara goes through another option that maybe it was not that that wasn't the case. Rather, he was doing 2 corners at the same time. If you can see here, he's doing 2 parallel corners, and only after tying it does he cut it. So those are the 2 options. And the Gemara says again that maybe it's a similar machloket, and that again, it would be parallel, right? One would say it's enough to just cut it afterwards and that would be okay. Others would say, no, you have to cut it first and then tie it on. The same thing, the same machloket is going to come up with the 4 species, the lulav. just to remind us that on Sukkot, another mitzvah, another commandment is you need to take the four species together: lulav, etrog, hadas, and aravot. And these four need to be bound together. The word for bound in the Gemara is eged. Eged la'agod means to bound, to bind. This is just interesting. The bus company is in Jerusalem is called the Eged Bus Company because it connects everybody together, I think. So that's just an aside. So here again, the Gemara asks again, if the lulav and these species need to be bound together, then do you need to bind them all together first before, right, when they're all valid, or can I bind them and afterwards make it valid? And the Gemara will explain what that means in a minute. The Gemara says no, not necessarily. This might not be parallel, but what's the idea of all these species being together? The idea is we want to glorify God's name or the commandments. We want to do them in the best way possible, right? Ze keli va'anvehu. We actually learned that together in Masechet Shabbat. That we actually, right, we say it in Az Yashir every morning, this idea that when we want to serve God, we want to do it in a beautiful way. And therefore, all the commandments that we do are going to be as beautiful and as beautiful as we can, but not necessarily an obligation. And from here, at the bottom of 11, we're going to get to another fundamental idea. The Gemara asks, why do we sit? Well, first it says, why are those the criteria for the schach? Again, we said that the schach needs to be grown from the ground, not attached at the moment, but have come from the ground and not to be able to become impure. The Gemara asks why. And here we get to a machloket that we will see again later on, but the machloket is, why in the first place are we sitting in a sukkah? There are two opinions. One opinion is that it's to remind us of the clouds of glory, the ananei hakavod, that encased the Jewish camp in the desert. And therefore, if it's to remind us of the clouds, and the Gemara says that clouds come from mist, mist comes from the ground, and therefore the schach has to be something that comes from the ground. The Gemara says that's very nice, but what about the other opinion? The other opinion is that we sit in Sukkot because the Jewish people actually lived in huts in the desert. So then now I don't have a source for why the schach needs to have grown from the ground. So that the second source would be a connection between the sukkah and the sacrifice that is brought on Sukkot, the korban chagiga. And the Gemara says, interestingly enough, that just like the sacrifice, i.e. the animal, is grown from the ground, that does not mean that it sprouts from the ground. Rather, it is sustained from eating from the ground. So too, the schach needs to have come from the ground. And here, the Gemara says, well, you might think that you can actually put animals on your roof. We cannot put animals on our roofs. It actually has to be something that really grows from the ground. From here, we're on Daf 12. Again, the schach, again, they go through different scenarios of what you can use, and we say that it must be something that grows from the ground, leaves, branches, or even fruits, maybe. We'll see. Okay, let's go to the next Mishnah on Daf 12. The next Mishnah says that bundles of straw or wood or cane are invalid as schach. But if you untie them, then it is okay, and you can use it for the walls. And the Gemara asks why that is the case, and the idea is that, well, we'll get to it in 1 second, but also brings up another case, which is that if you had a haystack and you dug out from the haystack enough so that you would have a space that would be a sukkah, that is invalid. Again, that schach was not put on as a roof for a sukkah. Rather, it was there from the beginning, and therefore it is invalid. The Gemara then proceeds to tell us that the reason those bundles of wood are not okay is if they were placed there to dry out, right? Again, when you dry out your straw or your wood, you would bundle in those days, you would bundle it up and then put it on the roof to dry. That, again, was not placed there as schach, as shade, and therefore it is not valid. And that would be not valid even biblically, deoraita. If, however, you put these bundles on top for schach, the Gemara says that that is invalid, but only on a rabbinic level and not on a biblical level. Since we're talking about, hold on one second. Since we are talking about things that are valid for schach, the Gemara says that you can use, here it shows, I'll show you both pieces at the same time. These are the wood parts, are arrow shafts. So the Gemara says you can use the male arrow shaft, meaning the one on top with a protrusion. That is a valid for schach, but not the bottom one, which has a hole in it. And the reason is that, again, wood that is flat or does not have a receptacle is not able to become impure. It's not able to become tameh, and therefore it is valid for schach. But this one, which has that receptacle, can become tameh and therefore impure, and therefore is invalid for schach. Okay, the Gemara then goes through other things that grow from the ground and tells us that at different stages they're either valid or invalid for schach. So like linen, it says that linen is made out of flax, which is harvested, soaked, then it's beaten, and then it's combed. So as soon as it becomes threads, that is already able to become impure and therefore not able to be used as schach. But in the beginning of the process, as long as it's still unprocessed, then it would be okay as schach. The same thing, daf 13 talks about different things that, though they do grow from the ground, if you use them as schach, it would be uncomfortable to sit under the sukkah. Let's say it had a bad smell or it has thorns and those fall into the sukkah. Even though all the other criteria are okay, they would still be invalid because it is not making a comfortable experience for the people who are sitting in the sukkah. The Gemara continues on daf 13 that offshoots of palm trees, right? Those of you who are familiar with palm trees, if you look at a palm tree, the offshoots actually grow kind of connected to each other. So the Gemara says that even though they're connected to each other, because they grew that way, they are still valid. And then even if you tie them on top, you're not creating that bundle. They're already connected to each other, and therefore you can use them as valid schach. Okay. All right, from here the Gemara talks about maror, a certain type of maror that is used for Pesach, and the certain type of hyssop, ezov, that is used for the para aduma ceremony, the red heifer ceremony. And since they're already talking about it, they talk about binding it together. Again, the same idea of eged, and do you need 3 or 2 is enough? Again, now let's go back to our sukkah. Here is an interesting concept. The Gemara says on Daf 13 that this conical wood hut that was used for like a trapper's hut, this you could use these these sticks as schach as long as you untie the top. Now, if you look carefully, the bottom, they are woven together. So how is that okay? The Gemara says that maybe you need to untie the knot at the end. But you don't need to completely take off that string because that string is not really meant to bind it together to carry it around. Rather, it's just meant to keep them together. And therefore, those of you who use those bamboo mats on your sukkah, right, if you look, they are many times kind of woven together. That's not considered bound. That's just considered kind of attached together, and that in a certain way that is considered valid for schach. Okay, here the Gemara introduces an idea, but we'll get to it probably next week, which is a gap of airspace that's less than 3 tfachim in the schach is valid for the schach. If it's more than 3 tfachim, then it is not. Again, tfachim, hand breadth. If it's within 3, it is okay. If it is more than that, then it is not okay. And from here, the Gemara goes into another discussion about purity and impurity. And this is the discussion of a handle. It's called a yad, like a hand, but really it means like a handle that you grasp. And here the Gemara talks about that if you have a utensil, that, like, let's think about an axe and its handle, literally, right? So that handle, if it's necessary for the axe, then if any part of that axe becomes impure, the entire thing becomes impure because they're seen as one unit. So then the Gemara asks, well, what about the stems of grapes? Are they considered a yad, right? A handle by means of holding, right? You hold, let's say, the grape cluster by its stem. So then the question is that considered a yad or not? The same thing with grain, right here. If I want to use this grain as my schach, if it's a yad, then it becomes impure, then it is invalid for schach. But if it isn't, then it would be valid. And therefore, the Gemara says that, let's say if you have branches with some fruit on it, as long as the majority of it is branch, then you can use it as schach because it's not seen as a handle for the fruit because the fruit is just a minority. But here, again, there's a difference of opinion if the stem, right, again, think the stem and the fruit join together versus the branch, which is not considered a yad. And from here, the Gemara goes on to a lengthy discussion about intention, which I think I'm going to save for next week, where we will join again, Bezrat Hashem, and we will continue our discussion about making valid schach out of branches that were either cut down for using for fruit or not, and we will see more of that next week. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and see you next week. Have a great week, everyone.